We are going to cover all the way up until probably Brown Board of Education, maybe as far as Little Rock 9. I doubt that we'll get past Little Rock 9 today, and then we'll cover most of the 60s next class period. So let's go ahead and get back over here. The first thing I'm going to start with is communism, and then, going into this. Remember, the civil rights era that we're talking about is going to be right when we have this Red Scare, right? Everybody's afraid of communist infiltration. One thing that's really going to drive this fear of communism is the fact that we've developed this atomic bomb before anybody else did, but by 1949, the Soviet Union has an atomic bomb, and that makes people very concerned in 1949, 1950, 51. That the Soviet Union has infiltrated our government. They're stealing secrets, and there's people that maybe seem like nice people that are actually working for the communist government. That's going to be this concern. So if you're doing things in the early 1950s that make it look like you're pushing for equal rights for all, equal rights for all, especially when you're talking about economic equality, it sounds a lot like communist ideas. Let me make sure. I'm going to pull up my own YouTube just to make sure it's recorded. I'm pretty sure it's working okay though. So we're going to remind you of that McCarran Internal Security Act. Remember, the act passed in 1950. Pat McCarran was a senator that sponsored this bill, and if you recall, that McCarran Act. One thing it does is it limits immigration from certain countries or people who were part of a communist government at some point, or at least were a member of a party of a communist government. But the main thing that we're going to look at here is this idea that we're going to create the Subversive Activities Control Board, that SACB. The Subversive Activities Control Board is set up over here. Is set up to basically keep track of all these communist organizations or subversive organizations. They have to register with the Attorney General's office, and then they're going to monitor all these different groups. And of course, you may recall when I talked about the McCarran Act, one of the reasons they're keeping tabs on all these groups is so that they can basically put them all in concentration camps or some way imprison them if we ever go to war against the Soviet Union. And that's reminiscent a little bit of what happened in 1917, 18. Remember, we had the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, which kind of limits your free speech during World War I. Now we're going to very proactively say that if we go to war against the Soviet Union, those people that are already part of organizations that were Soviet Union, we're going to just put them all in prison ahead of time, whether or not they're actually going to do anything that's against the law. Right? That's going to be part of the SACB. Again, it's going to be up to the Attorney General of the United States to decide, and this ACC and this Subversive Activities Control Board. It'll be up to them to decide which groups are actually communist or subversive. So kind of keep that in mind, because these next three guys we're going to talk about were all parts of groups that were considered communist or subversive. Some of them were very outwardly communist, though. So we'll start off with Langston Hughes. Right, all three of these guys we talked about before. W.B. Du Bois, I've probably mentioned in at least 5 or 6 classes up to this point. Langston Hughes and Robeson I brought up when I talked about the 1920s. Right, those are two guys that become prominent figures during the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, of course, is this poet. Right, we played a poem earlier in the semester. Right, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He was a young man at the time. He was born, I think, in 1901. So as we go into this Cold War era, he's like in his 40s and 50s. In 1934, he was president of the League of Struggle for Negro Rights. So this would be a civil rights organization, the League of Struggle for Negro Rights. Now, this organization was established in 1930 by the American Communist Party. And the American Communist Party was financially supported by the Soviet Union. So basically, that League of Struggle for Negro Rights has links to the Soviet Union, which is going to be problematic as we get into this Cold War era, because you're not going to want to have any real strong ties to the Soviet Union. Langston Hughes already has them going in the 1930s. In fact, in the early 1930s, Langston Hughes was invited by the Soviet Union to go over there and make a movie based upon how life was like for African Americans in the South, in the United States in particular, or in the southern part of the United States in particular. So basically, the reason the Soviet Union invites Langston Hughes over is because they want to make a kind of a propaganda film that says we have racism in place. I talked about this way back at the beginning of the semester. We have racism in place because of material competition, right? It's because, according to this communist this ideology, it's because you want to get an advantage another group of people. What you're going to do is about that group of people and say that we are better than them, and because of that we deserve advantages that they don't deserve, right? So that's what we're going to see. So the Soviet Union is going to say, hey, Langston Hughes, come on over here, make this film to show how African Americans are suffering in the United States while the white population gets the power and the money, and we're going to say that the reason this happens is because of capitalism, right? The communists are saying capitalism is evil because it creates these distinctions in classes, and class is often tied to race. So Langston Hughes is brought over basically to make this film. Now, the film is never completed because the Soviet Union decides to try to build a better relationship with the U.S. in the 1930s. So that film is never made. But Langston Hughes has been in the Soviet Union, and in 1934 he was president of that League of Struggle for Negro Rights. Just to give you an idea of what the League of Struggle for Negro Rights did, is it called for a separate nation within the United States for people of African descent. So essentially what they wanted is kind of an independent country either outside the U.S. or within the U.S. where African American people would have political power. When we get to the mid to late 1960s, we're going to see Stokely Carmichael, or later on his name will be Kwame Ture. We're going to see Stokely Carmichael saying something similar, and Malcolm X will also say something similar to this. Langston Hughes is the leader of this organization in 1934. He leaves shortly after that, and actually by 1936 the organization goes away. But in 1940, Langston Hughes also participated in a group called American Peace Mobilization. The American Peace Mobilization also had roots in communism, right? The Communist Party, their Popular Front in the United States, kind of built up this group in 1940 after World War II started. Remember, World War II starts basically in September of 1939. If you recall, in August of 1939, so the Soviet Union and Germany signed a non-aggression pact. So basically, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union weren't really allies, but they got along. So once we get into early 1940, the American Peace Mobilization Group is going to say that we should stay out of the war, right? We should not join the British side or the French side. We should stay out of the war altogether. Now, while we are pushing the United States to remain peaceful, of course, Germany is going to build up, and the Soviet Union is also starting to build up their military as well. I'm sorry, let me close this out. My YouTube had a little pop-up. So this group was basically accused of trying to weaken the United States while the Soviet Union gained power. Now, later on in 1940, the American Peace Mobilization will change its name. Don't worry about all the details to this, but just know that they actually start being for the war for the most part. They'll change their name to the American People's Mobilization after Germany invades the Soviet Union. So you can see this communist tinge as part of this group as we go through the 1940s. Now the group will kind of fall apart and then kind of regain strength after we drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as a result of that, they will push for us to stay out of war again. So later on, this American Peace Mobilization will be considered a subversive organization under Executive Order 9835, which, if you recall, that was what we called the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. So Langston Hughes definitely had some strong communist ties. Now, I think I've said probably a few times this semester that the hardest quiz we're going to have, generally speaking, is probably going to be the quiz number 5. Quiz 5 is going to have a lot of matching. I will probably have at least 17 terms. The 17 names or terms will be organizations and people. Now, I try to keep it very simple. Some of this, when I mention some of these organizations, it'll be just tied to certain individuals. Some of it will have to do with kind of their intent. So make sure you're familiar with some of these groups. American Peace Mobilization, I don't know if I'll use them. League of Struggle for Negro Rights will probably be on the study guide when I create that. When we go to W.B. Du Bois, so let me back up just a step. So Langston Hughes, in 1953, would then be brought before Joseph McCarthy's hearings, the McCarthy hearings. He's going to be grilled, questioned, embarrassed. They'll bring shame upon him. And after 1953, he'll lose a lot of his influence. Right now, he's kind of basically brought forth as this person who's communist. So in the early Cold War era, it's probably better not to follow somebody who's communist when we are in this era where it looks like we may go to war with the Soviet Union. So Langston Hughes is going to lose a lot of that power and influence when we get to the 1950s. And again, part of the reason I have this slide is to kind of define, in part, how the civil rights era rises up in the 1950s and who's not a part of it, right? One thing that I try to push through the semester is I don't believe there's really kind of just a civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s. I really believe civil rights, all history, has beyond the era of discussing them. So when I talked about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois at the beginning of the semester, I try to bring a line all the way up to this point, basically saying there's already an effort out there. It's just not as successful as what we're going to see in the 1950s and 1960s. And part of what's going to make you successful as a civil rights proponent is being not communist, right? If you're a communist, you're probably not going to be a very successful leader during this Cold War. W.B. Du Bois is the next guy we'll talk about. W.B. Du Bois, again, we've mentioned him several times in the past. Here, I'm not sure, I think I'm going to talk about the Council on African Affairs before I talk about Peace Information Center. So W.B. Du Bois was the vice chair, so second in command on this group, this organization called Council on African Affairs. Council on African Affairs would eventually be considered a subversive organization according to the McCarran Act. So in 1953, this will be labeled a subversive organization, the Council on African Affairs. This organization in the 1940s was basically trying to unite people of African descent around the world with people in Africa. So essentially, this organization is going to be fighting for civil rights in the United States while simultaneously trying to help African nations gain independence from from imperial powers. So they're going to be raising money and raising awareness and traveling to Africa, trying to put pressure on to let go of some of those African colonies. And while at the same time they're working in the United States saying, you know, what's going on over here? This idea of white superiority over black inferiority is going on in Africa too, even though Africa was established, or the African nations, generally speaking, are going to be vast majority African people. So they're linking the struggles we have, the African American people have in the United States, with the struggles that people in Africa have in their own territories, right? So this would be considered, this communist organization, basically saying, people, you know, people of African descent around the world unite, which is kind of like people of, you know, workers of the world unite. Du Bois did have communist ties as well. In the 1940s, he claimed he was not a communist, but before he dies, he does join the Communist Party, just a little before he died. Bear in mind, he is getting pretty old by this time. Now, he also helped establish, or he chaired, the Peace Information Center, PIC. Let's see. So he established this Peace Information Center. I'm sorry, shut down this computer real quick. And the reason for establishing this Peace Information Center was basically to try to get countries around the world to stop building bombs. Peace Information Center was established in 1950. I remember in 1949, the Soviet Union tested their first bomb, and then in 1950, we have an organization, Peace Information Center, that's telling us, stop building bombs. Now, in actuality, Peace Information Center is telling the entire world, stop building atomic bombs. We're against atomic bombs. We don't want this type of disaster. But the way the FBI and the federal government is interpreting this is they are saying and arguing that Du Bois is trying to get the United States to stop building bombs. That way the Soviet Union can continue to build bombs and they'll become stronger than us. So that's how this is being interpreted. So that group, Council on African Affairs and the Peace Information Center, both of these groups would be considered subversive organizations. Now, the Peace Information Center in 1950, remember that's established the same time as the McCarran Act. That was considered to be a subversive organization, and W.E.B. Du Bois was told to register Peace Information Center with the Attorney General's Office and the Subversive Activities Control Board. And of course, if Du Bois does that, then basically the federal government's going to keep tabs on all of their members, and if they ever go to war, then all of their members will be stuck in concentration camps. Du Bois says, there's no way I'm going to register this group with the federal government. So the federal government then indicts Du Bois. They issue this indictment and they take him to trial in 1951 because he was breaking the law, right? He's failing to register this organization with the federal government according to the McCarran Act. So he's brought forth before the federal government. While all this is going on, the NAACP turns their back on Du Bois. They shun him. They just separate themselves from him. Keep in mind, Du Bois was one of the founding members and possibly, arguably, the most important founding member of the NAACP, right? He was the editor of that Crisis magazine all the way up until the early 1930s. Without Du Bois, NAACP may not have even existed, right? Du Bois is a very important guy for the NAACP. He's going to really push this around and spread the communication. But Walter White was the name of the NAACP leader at the time, basically turns away from Du Bois, and while Du Bois is being pressured by the federal government, the NAACP just stands aside and refuses to speak out on behalf of Du Bois. But Du Bois did have a friend and a guy that you've probably heard of named Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was brought forth before, he was invited to speak on behalf of Du Bois during the trial in 1951. But when the federal government found out that Einstein was going to basically be a character witness for Du Bois, the federal government dropped the case. Du Bois was not found guilty. He did not go to prison. But despite the fact that this case was dropped, the federal government took away Du Bois's passport to make sure they could keep tabs on him and make sure he did not leave the country. Right? There are suspicions that he is a communist, and as a communist, he may go to another country, share information about the federal government, share secrets from the United States with Soviet agents. So from 1951 to 1958, Du Bois will have his passport removed. He's now weakened, and of course, he has these communist ties, which means after 1950 or 51, Du Bois will also basically be shunned, tossed aside, and not be very influential in civil rights legislation or matters. Now we'll go to Robeson. Now remember, I talked about Du Bois a few times already. I've already explained how important he is. I'm going to bring them up again, either later this class or next class. But now we'll talk about Paul Robeson. Robeson, again, we talked about in the 1920s, right? He was the guy that I talked about as being, whether or not you like him and like his ideas, he's a fascinating guy, right? He goes to Rutgers on academic scholarship. While he's at Rutgers, he plays football, first-team All-American football player, graduates valedictorian from Rutgers, goes on to play professional football while attending law school at Columbia School of Law. Gets his law degree at Columbia. Yeah, so all of that is just amazing in and of itself. And of course, what he winds up becoming best known for is being an actor, right? He's an actor and singer, I played the clip of him singing Old Man River, or at least part of that, when we talked about Robeson before. So he's more of an entertainer than anything else, but he's definitely a very well-educated, very strong speaker. And just to kind of give you an idea of what Robeson does, I'm going to play Paul Robeson for you. This will be from an Australia interview. Actually, I'll do that after I talk about Robeson. So I'm going to say this first. Now, I mentioned that Du Bois was the vice chair, second in command for the Council on African Affairs. Paul Robeson was first. He was the chair. He was the leader of that Council on African Affairs. Now, for any African American to have a position of power or authority over Du Bois is significant. Really, to have anybody within an organization have power or authority over Du Bois is significant, whether they be white or black or any other race or gender, right? Now, Du Bois was a significant, well-accomplished, very intelligent man or person. Robeson, again, very intelligent, very influential, very powerful speaker. So he has this position of power. We've already discussed the Council on African Affairs by 1953 would be listed as a legislative organization. Robeson in 1946 also created the American Crusade Against Lynching, the ACAL. One of the members of this organization was Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was part of this organization too. The American Crusade Against Lynching was basically going to be a very aggressive anti-lynching organization. Keep in mind that in those days, lynching was a state law. So if you wanted to string up anybody, whether it be a white person, black person, Filipino, whatever you're doing, it's a state matter, right? So if the state doesn't want to investigate it, it's not going to be investigated. So Paul Robeson wants the federal government to crack down on this. So he goes to Harry S. Truman. President Truman, he tells President Truman that the federal government needs to crack down on this. They need to aggressively attack lynching, and this needs to be done with federal legislation. Truman, again, he does support civil rights, but he didn't think it was really the federal government's job, and it was really going to be up to Congress, not him. So Robeson basically rebukes Truman. After all, Truman later on is going to use a lot of executive powers to do other things, right? So Robeson rebukes Truman, uses this group, and they're going to basically proactively look for lynchers themselves. That's essentially what this organization is going to do. Again, the NAACP is going to distance themselves from this organization, although Langston Hughes and Du Bois both supported Robeson, especially Du Bois. Now, I will play a clip from Robeson. Actually, let me do this one more thing. Robeson was communist. In fact, in 1949, Robeson spoke at something called the Paris Peace Congress. The Paris Peace Congress in 1949. He was invited over to speak at this event in Paris, France. This event was sponsored by the Soviet Union. He was asked to speak. Remember, he was an international star, right? He's been a big star on stage, right? A very famous Othello, very famous singer and actor. Invited to speak on stage. When he went on stage, of course, this is at the beginning of the Cold War, he told the audience that people of African descent or African Americans were fighting for freedom and fighting for equality. And he said that we don't want a war against the Soviet Union. Now, when he says we don't want a war against the Soviet Union, he's basically mainly speaking for African Americans. But on the other hand, he's also kind of saying, you know, we as part of America don't want war against the Soviet Union. As this is a time when we're thinking maybe there's going to be a war, because 1949, of course, is the year the Soviet Union has their bomb tested. Now, when news comes back that Robeson says that we don't want to go to war, the way the news was reported is the news stated that Robeson said that if we go to war, black people aren't going to fight. They will support the Soviet Union instead of the United States. That's not really what Robeson said, but because it's reported that way, Robeson is then vilified. The media and the government are going to use this to basically say that Robeson is a communist and he's a traitor. Nobody should follow him. He's going to be blacklisted. The federal government will get some of the most famous African Americans to speak out against Paul Robeson. So Walter White would speak out against Paul Robeson, and Jackie Robinson Robinson. Jackie Robinson, I haven't talked about him in a longer African-American history class. I might talk about Jackie Robinson. But Jackie Robinson in 1947 became the first African-American baseball player to play in Major League Baseball, which was, I'm thinking it was the spectator sport in the United States at that time. So Jackie Robinson is a very popular figure in 1950. So after Robeson talks about this, Jackie Robinson himself puts down Paul Robeson and said that Robeson was being silly. That's the word he used about Paul Robeson, was that Paul Robeson was being silly. Now, again, Robinson was basing his statement on what was being reported that Robeson said, not what Robeson actually said. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, we're going to play a little bit of Paul Robeson, just so you can kind of get an idea of what he said. Now, when I've tried to share videos in the past, it hasn't worked out all that well, which is why I'm using this MacBook. It's an old MacBook, but this MacBook today, hopefully it'll work better today. But let me go and try to share this video with you if I'm able to. So be just a minute. Okay. No.
American Negro for so long has been a second-class citizen in the United States. Still is, I'm sorry. How is it that he's contributed so much to American culture? Well, music, dance, everything.
Well, I have to be very modest about that. I would say certainly as we look at the African people in Nigeria, for example, I just got a wonderful invitation to go to Nigeria to be present at the installation of the Governor General, Ezekwe, an old friend. And I had to cable him. I'm in the stadium. I sure would like to be with you. But I'm out here with some good folks, but I'll get to Nigeria later.
Perhaps do you feel that Africa is to some extent an affinity for home, or do you still feel America is essentially your home? How do you feel?
Well, let me come here. I'll come to that in just a second. But to come back to it, so I would say the Africans and the American Negroes have turned out to be an extraordinarily gifted people. The great tragedy is that by not making us full-class citizens as yet in America, they may be losing, I don't know how much yet. And to come back, I would say that unquestionably, I am an American, born there. My father slaved there. Upon the backs of my people was developed the primary wealth of America. The primary wealth. You have to have accumulated wealth to start, to build. You did it another way here in Australia. You had to build your accumulated wealth. You just came and took it. You know what I mean? And that's what they did in most of the countries. That's what you Europeans did. You just took it. We got to catch up with you a little bit. That's so in America. So there's a lot of America that belongs to me yet. But just like the Scottish American is proud of being from Scotland, I'm proud for being African. Now, in our school books, they tried to tell me that all Africans were savages. So I got to London and found most of the Africans I knew were going to Oxford and Cambridge and doing very well, and culture. And even once somebody had the temerity, after one had conquered the Chinese people and imposed upon them the opium trade and everything else, to suggest that they were a backward people, just the people who had been civilized so long over the rest of you folks didn't make any sense at all. So somewhere, it was wonderful to find about the colored peoples of the world that they were very advanced. So I would say today that I'm an American who is infinitely prouder to be of African descent, no question about it. No question about it. I'm an Afro-American, and I don't use the word American ever loosely again.
Now, this was the feeling.
That's right.
That when you were in London about 1937, 38, you really had the world at your feet then. I mean, your tremendous success, you were recognized over the world, and yet you went back to America. Was this the feeling that took you back?
I felt I had to go back to my people. That's right. Because the going was tough. And today, I can go back. I just had my passport renewed. I could go back to pretty tough times now. But any time I could get a telegram next week that the Negro people had gathered somewhere in one of their conferences, as they could, and say, Paul, in the difficulties that are going on in America, Would you come back and help us? I would take the plane as soon as I finished talking.
Okay, and let me go back over to, oh, where's my camera? Okay, and just out of curiosity, were you guys able to see the video okay? If somebody would just respond. Yes, okay, so it wasn't as blurry, it looked better than when I tried it on my other computer, right? Okay, perfect, all right. So that will be available on YouTube as well. There'll be another video that I may play at the very end today. It may be saved for next class, but we'll go ahead and pick back up. Let me share or get my PowerPoint back up in front of me. Oops, that's not it. Cancel that. Okay, so that's Paul Robeson. So Robeson is speaks out. You can tell he's a very strong speaker. Remember, he's a big guy as well, very intelligent guy. In 1952, he was awarded the International Stalin Prize. The International Stalin Prize was a prize for those who strengthened peace among comrades. It was issued by the Soviet Union, and that was the same year that Joseph Stalin died, actually. So he's given this prize. He was honored by the Soviet Union with this prize in 1952. In 1950, when Robeson, or after Robeson was basically shunned for making this speech in Paris, France, he also lost his passport. So he would be without a passport from 1950 to 1958. So around the same time that Du Bois was out of his passport. I'll mention one other thing about Robeson. Now, this really hurt Robeson financially as well. All these places where Robeson was going to perform, or he had concerts and so forth, a lot of those are going to be canceled. So his annual income before 1950 and after 1950 went from about $150,000 per year in those days. $150,000 a year in those days was around, sort of close to about $2 million per year. So he was making, in today's terms, close to $2 million per year before 1950. And that $150,000 in those days terms dropped down to about $3,000, or a little less than $3,000 per year, which in today's terms means he was making about $30,000 to $35,000 a year. So it'd be like today going from a $2 million per year salary to about a $30,000 per year salary because of these ties to communism, in addition to the fact that he lost that kind of political and social power as a result of what happens here. So again, another reason why Robeson, who was very actively involved in civil rights proponents, as a civil rights proponent, winds up losing a lot of that power and sway in the 1950s. Now we're going to start moving towards the start of desegregation. Now keep in mind that we have these separate but equal laws, right? That Plessy versus Ferguson case way back in the 1890s established that states could pass separate but equal laws. Now remember, it has to be separate but equal. Now inherently, equal can't be separate, but that's going to be what the law states, what the court decision states. States had to maintain, or could maintain, separate but equal facilities. So we'll go to the Sweat versus Painter case. Now there's other cases that we could discuss before this one, but we'll start with the Sweat versus Painter case. Now Herman Marion Sweat was a mailman, formerly a teacher, who in 1946 applied to the University of Texas School of Law. So University of Texas School of Law, he applies to go there. Now he was an excellent student. He had an outstanding academic record. By this time he was also married, and he was also like 34 years old by this time. So Herman Marion Sweat applies to go to the University of Texas Law School. Only problem is it was only for white students, and the problem for Texas was that there was no law school for black students, which meant that Texas was not maintaining separate but equal law schools, right? They only had a law school for white students, no law school for black students. So he applies to the University of Texas School of Law. Theophilus Painter was the president of the University of Texas at that time. And when he gets the application for the law school, he counters, the University of Texas counters by saying, hey, how about this? Why don't we just pay for scholarships so you can go out of state? And that was very normal back in those days. So up into the 1950s, across the South, African Americans were high ability students, made outstanding grades, were very intelligent and accomplished students. What Southern states tended to do is they would pay for those students to go to schools like Harvard or Yale or Princeton. So instead of going to UT, you go to like an Ivy League school. You want to go into a school that very few people can go to, but the state will help you get into those institutions, just so they don't have to desegregate the institutions. So Theophilus Painter and the University of Texas system tells Sweatt, you know, we don't have a position for you because we only have a white school. So how about we give you scholarships to go to a law school up north somewhere? Herman Marion Sweatt was 34 years old. He was already married. He already owned a house. For anybody who's in that position, right? If you're an adult with a settled life and a wife, and you may have kids, maybe not, it's not necessarily going to be all that easy to drop everything and then go off to school, right? When you're younger and single, it's not quite as hard, right? I know I was young and single. I used to live on ham sandwiches and ramen noodles all the time when I didn't make very much money, and I didn't complain about it. It was fine. I could do that. Now, would I want to provide that for my family? Yeah, probably not. But you can do that when you're single. And Sweatt's not really in a position to just drop everything and go out of state just because the University of Texas didn't want to admit him. So he gets the help of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They're going to lend their lawyers out to help him out. One of the lawyers that's going to take the case is a guy named Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall will represent Sweatt. So again, Sweatt applies to University of Texas Law School in February of 1946. University of Texas appeals or goes to the state attorney general knowing that we don't have separate but equal. So the state attorney general says, don't allow Sweatt into the white school, but build something for him to go to. So they come up with these different ideas. Perhaps just kind of rent some space off campus and have professors volunteer to go to that space and teach Sweatt in a separate environment. So basically they're saying, we're only going to have one black law school student, and we'll open it up to others as well. We'll find professors who will volunteer to go off campus to teach him in like some room a couple of blocks away from UT, right? That doesn't work because you lose the whole idea of law school, right? Part of law school is communicating and interacting with other legal scholars, bringing forth these arguments, right? When you go to a courtroom, it's not like you by yourself. You're in a room with other lawyers, judges, jury, and everything else. So you have to have like a community to work around to really understand the law school experience and become a good lawyer. So Sweatt is offered is tendered this offer to take over this space. I'm sorry, my 4-year-old's back there, which is a little loud. I apologize. But he's offered to go off campus and basically take classes off campus in a segregated facility. And he says, no, I don't want to do that. The lawyers say, no, we're not going to do that. We want to have a classroom. We want to experience just like the white students. So we want to desegregate. So UT still hesitant about doing that. So instead, what they do is they decide they're going to build a whole new school. So in the fall of 1946, University of Texas system created what was called at the time the Texas State University for Negroes. That was the name of the school, the Texas State University for Negroes. This will be a segregated school for black students in Houston. They will have a law school as part of the curriculum. So they will have a law school at the Texas State University for Negroes. In 1951, that school will change its name to Texas Southern University. Texas Southern University, of course, is still around today. They do have a law school. It's a very good law school, and the law school is named after Thurgood Marshall. It is called the Thurgood Marshall School of Law. So now the University of Texas builds a whole new school for Herman Marion Sweatt, right? One black student applies to law school, and now we're going to build a whole new university eventually for African Americans to go where they can also attend law school. Now, they only get a few applicants, and Herman Marion Sweatt in 1946, with his legal defense, say, no, that's not going to work for me because it's going to be a segregated facility. It will not be equal to what the white law school is going to have, right? The University of Texas Law School has been there a long time. They have this huge, massive library. They have these excellent scholars and professors. And whatever you put down in Houston, especially in the 1940s, is going to be what UT is offering in the 1940s. So the NAACP and Herman Marion Sweatt pushed this court case on all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And I will mention that Herman Marion Sweatt had some physical ailments. He had issues with it. He had heart problems. He had a heart attack when he was in his mid-30s. He had stomach ulcers that were very painful. So as this is going on, Herman Marion Sweatt's health is really kind of deteriorating too. Now, finally, in 1950, the United States Supreme Court takes up the case, and they say that the University of Texas Law School has to desegregate. So now, in 1950, UT's School of Law is now open to white and black students and cannot be segregated thanks to this Sweatt versus Painter court case. So this will be a landmark case that would desegregate University of Texas School of Law. Now, you don't necessarily have to know this, but Herman Marion Sweatt went to UT School of Law for about a year and a half, and basically he was sick most of the time that he was there, and he wound up not getting his law degree. But he's still going to be a significant person in desegregation history because of the Sweatt versus Painter court case. Now we go to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. It's a pretty good chance this will be the last thing we'll talk about today because we'll spend a bit of time here. Now in 1954, we see this court case decided in the United States Court, handled by what we call the Warren Court. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was appointed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren to be Chief Justice. Now, when I talked about Eisenhower before, I mentioned that Eisenhower was a very moderate Republican. Generally speaking, he supported civil rights, but in his heart of hearts, he really believed that states had to resolve these issues themselves. He didn't really believe in using the federal government to enforce these legislation on states. But he's the one that appointed Earl Warren. And after 1954, Eisenhower is going to regret appointing Earl Warren because Earl Warren will be the main justice responsible for establishing federal power over states in desegregation cases for the rest of the 1950s and into the mid-1960s. Actually, maybe late 1960s. So we'll go over here. So now we get to this Brown v. Board of Education case. Now, this, again, is really a group of cases. The Brown case itself came from Topeka, Kansas. The leading attorneys for the NAACP leading up to this were first Charles Hamilton Houston. Houston was passed away in 1950. And after that, Thurgood Marshall takes over. So Thurgood Marshall is going to be the lead counsel for the NAACP in 1954. Now, just in case I forget to mention this later on, because it may come up again on an exam or a quiz or something, Thurgood Marshall would eventually become the first African-American appointed to the United States Supreme Court. So Thurgood Marshall will become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. This Brown v. Board of Education case is going to be the main case that makes him kind of the superstar lawyer, although that Sweatt versus Painter case was also pretty big. So we get to this court case. The Supreme Court, this Warren Court, stated that public schools across the country should be desegregated. So you cannot have separate but equal schools. So we would desegregate schools across the country according to this decision. Let me go over here. Now, later on, after this decision, the states are wondering, do we have to do this now? Is there a specific time frame that we have to do this? And the decision says that this has to be done with all deliberate speed. all deliberate speed. So that's the term they're going to use. So basically what they're saying is that we want you to plan this out, right? If you do something deliberately, you think about it ahead of time, you consider the consequences, you make a plan, and then you do it, right? That's deliberate. So in that, when you think about deliberate in that manner, you're basically saying that you need to take your time. Now, southern states are going to say, well, the time is not ready yet, right? 1954, 1955 is not ready. If we do this in 1954 or 55, we're going to have racial violence. People aren't going to be happy. People are going to suffer, right? That's going to be the southern mentality. So we're not going to see this happen right away. In fact, in Fort Worth, right, just in Fort Worth, Texas, we're not going to see fully desegregated schools using busing anyways until 1967. Even then, you'll say that the busing hasn't fully integrated the schools, but the plan's not going to be put in place until like 1962 or 63. So it's going to take some time, right? Just because we have this court decision in 1954 doesn't mean southern states are going to right away allow us black students into white schools. Generally speaking, that's what it's going to be, black students going into white schools. That's an image of the Warren Court. Let me go over here real quick. There's your Warren Court. Earl Warren, of course, is front center. And now we're going to discuss some of the resistance. Now, if you've learned about Brown v. Board of Education before, you tend to think of this as a very positive thing. Now we're going to have integrated schools. Education, in theory, is going to be much better. That's the hope. But keep in mind that not everybody, not all African Americans were for this, right? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of white people in the South that are going to be against this, but a lot of African American leaders were also against this. So we'll mention W.B. Du Bois first, right? As I mentioned Du Bois again, here he is. Now, just a reminder, W.B. Du Bois was the first African-American Harvard PhD, graduated from Harvard in 1895. He was a sociology and history professor in Atlanta, University of Atlanta, and he participated in that Harlem Renaissance earlier on. He was also a founding member of the NAACP in 1910. He edited the Crisis magazine until 1934. But Du Bois was against desegregation. He was against integration. And I'll read a couple of his quotes. So this will be one quote from Du Bois. He said, quote, "The plain fact faces us that either African Americans will have separate schools or they will not be educated." Right? That's going to be Du Bois' quote. Right? The plain fact faces us that either African Americans will have separate schools or they will not be educated. He goes on to argue that there are many public school systems in the North where Negroes are admitted and tolerated, but they are not educated. They are crucified. So basically, what Du Bois is saying is that just because you desegregate schools doesn't mean you're going to have better education for African Americans. Basically, what you're saying is that white schools and white teachers are better than black schools and black teachers. Du Bois makes the argument that if you integrate schools, what's going to wind up happening is you're going to have black kids put into white schools with white teachers, and the white teachers and the white students aren't going to want those students there. So what's going to wind up happening is the black students aren't going to get much of an education, and they may actually suffer physically and emotionally as well. So Du Bois is against this whole idea of integration, right? To Du Bois, it's more about empowering the black community themselves and allowing them to rise up, but give them the same tools and same opportunities that white students have. So Du Bois was against this. We will also mention Zora Neale Hurston, right? Zora Neale Hurston was one of the most influential African-American literary figures of the first half of the 20th century. Remember, she was the first African-American woman to attend Columbia University. She was also a big member of the Harlem Renaissance. I have a couple of images here. The first that we see is a stamp honoring Zora Neale Hurston. I think you guys all know what stamps are, although I'm not sure that any of you have ever mailed anything. And then Of course, this is an image of a movie or poster for a movie called Their Eyes Were Watching God. That was based upon the Zora Neale Hurston book. So Zora Neale Hurston was against this as well. And I'll read a quote from Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston said, quote, "But if there are adequate Negro schools and prepared instructors and instructions, then there is nothing different except the presence of white people. For this reason, I regard the ruling of the United States Supreme Court as insulting rather than honoring my race." End quote. So Zora Neale Hurston, her reaction is that Supreme Court decision is basically telling the African American community that now that we have white teachers, now you can get a good education. Now that you're in white schools, now you can get a good education. And Zora Neale Hurston says that's insulting, right? You're basically saying with this decision, according to Hurston, that black teachers, black administrations, black principals, black schools aren't good enough for the black kids. They need to go to a white school to get that education, right? That's her response. That's the way she views this. Basically, to Hurston, if African American schools were better funded, better trained, and they allowed better opportunities, those schools would be better for the black students than the white schools would be. So Hurston takes offense to this. Now we'll move on to another guy that you've probably heard of if you, at some point, if you've ever studied any of this history, a guy named Malcolm X. We'll talk more about Malcolm X when we get to the end of the African American Civil Rights lecture part as well, next class. Malcolm X was also against this. Now, he was a spokesperson, not the leader, but a spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam is kind of a civil rights organization in the United States that was Islamic based, and they believed in separation versus segregation. They don't believe in integration. The way that Malcolm X viewed this, and again, we'll give more details on Malcolm X later. The way Malcolm X viewed this was he viewed this as very challenging for the African American community because basically he viewed white people as being evil, violent people. So if you view white people as being violent and hateful, why would you want your students to go to school with them? That was his response. Why would I want my 8-year-old daughter or son to go to an elementary school with a teacher and principal and fellow students that all hated her? What kind of response is that going to be? What kind of education is that student going to get? So that's going to be the response from Malcolm X. So these are going to be 3 significant leaders within the African American community going in the 1950s, especially 60s for Malcolm X, that are going to be against desegregation, right? They are for separation or segregation for various reasons that I've already given. Now, there's other challenges to desegregation as well. Geographical issues would come into play. Now, just to give you an idea, I provided this map. This is a map that I created of Fort Worth, Texas. Each star represents black schools before schools were desegregated. So you can see where all of the black schools were. If you know Fort Worth, then you know this star way over here east, that's Fort Worth Dunbar. So all of these schools over here are where the black schools were, which basically meant that the vast majority of Fort Worth's black population, because of housing restriction or housing covenants and laws put in place before the 1950s, all of the black population tended to live down in kind of this southeastern part of Fort Worth, which means if you want black students to go to white schools, they're going to have to travel outside of their community. So instead of going to a school that's 1 block away from you, you're going to wind up going to a school that's like 3 or 4 miles away from you. Now, you may not always have transportation. This becomes very problematic for a lot of students over a long period of time. You will have white students also bus to black schools, but usually for like maybe a period or 2 in high school, and maybe for like a year in elementary school, something like that. But generally speaking, you're going to see the black students going to white schools. So geographical issues will come into play over time, right? Busing becomes a big problem for this, as we get in the 1980s and 90s especially. There's also going to be other repercussions. We're going to have a loss of educators within the African American community. Just to put some numbers behind it, in 1954, there were 82,000 black educators in the United States. 82,000. 82,000 African American, basically teachers, principals, vice principals, and so forth. A decade later, we're down to 38,000. So we go from 82,000 black educators to 38,000 educators. Because what's going to happen once they start desegregating schools? Are they going to keep the black schools open that are wooden structures with dilapidated facilities, or are they going to use the nice brick buildings that the white students were using? Obviously, the white parents aren't going to want to send their kids to the black schools that are inferior to the white schools. Just to put some numbers behind this, if you look at Fort Worth schools in the 1920s, which is what I've looked at in the past, a typical white school would cost like maybe $20,000 to $30,000 to build at that, in early 1900s. A black school might cost like $5,000, maybe a little less. So the white schools were much more expensive, much nicer than the black schools were. So essentially what's going to wind up happening is we're going to close a lot of those black schools and send them over to white schools. So a lot of the people that worked at the black schools are going to wind up losing their jobs. So you see the white teachers stay in place, the black teachers lose their jobs, which means a lot of those white teachers who may have been against integration in the first place may not be the best teachers for those black students. And if that's the case, and those black students that are being taught by white teachers, their only experience or their primary experience going forward is going to be with white teachers, they're probably not going to be white. They're probably not going to want to be teachers either. So we're going to see a huge loss in jobs for African Americans, and the additional losses that we have from 1975 to 1985 reflect that far fewer African Americans are going into education. So we're going to see a 66% drop in African American students pursuing degrees in education between 1975 and 1985. So those African American students that are growing up in an age where we're desegregating the schools, they're not going to want to become teachers themselves, which this means that by the time we get to the 1980s and 1990s, we're going to have lower numbers of African American teachers available for students going forward. Right? So these are some of the negative consequences to Brown v. Board of Education. I think we're going to end there now. That way we don't run out of time with Montgomery bus boycott. So we'll end there now. So we've given some of the negatives to the Brown v. Board of Education, some of the negatives behind desegregation. Now we're going to start pushing more towards integration and some of the positives of integration going forward. So we'll pick back up with Montgomery bus boycott, introduce Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and a whole bunch of other people. The way I teach civil rights, we're probably not going to focus as much on Martin Luther King Jr. as what teachers may have given you in the past. We'll go ahead and end there today. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. And again, this video should be put in Blackboard within the next few minutes. All right, take care. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and let me know if you need anything. All right, take care. Bye.